After the previous trip, engineer Ed Davenport warned Clinchfield management that Locomotive 740 needed more than the standard inspections before it ran again. According to newspaper and railroad historical accounts, the 25-year-old steam locomotive was cleared to run anyway. Then, at 1:15 in the morning on April 21, 1948, the boiler tore itself off the frame. It was reported to have traveled roughly 360 feet down the track, and the explosion scattered pieces of the engine across the Nolichucky Gorge. When rescue crews arrived, they found Davenport and fireman Rex Phillips among the wreckage of the only boiler explosion in 67 years of Clinchfield Railroad history. This case illustrates what can happen when a locomotive engineer raises concerns about a machine developing problems, and operating decisions are still made based on paperwork showing the engine within acceptable limits. Davenport was 53, a World War I veteran from Avery County, North Carolina, and he had spent his entire working life aiming for that engineer position. He was an experienced man who understood steam locomotives, and he knew when something felt wrong with the machine he was running. After the previous trip on 740, he specifically requested additional maintenance work beyond what the mandatory inspection schedule required. What specific issues he had noticed were not recorded, but the locomotive was showing mechanical concerns. It was a quarter-century old, and he wanted it looked at more carefully. Management reviewed the inspection information available at the time, and they allowed the engine to continue in service. Rex Phillips was 33, an experienced fireman who had been working the Clinchfield long enough to know the boiler inside and out, and he survived the initial blast long enough to speak with rescuers. What he said in that time is what makes this entire story stick with you. According to newspaper reports, he told them we had plenty water before he passed. I can't understand why it happened. The fireman's primary responsibility is maintaining adequate water level in the boiler, watching that gauge constantly throughout the run, and Phillips maintained until the end that the water level was fine. That statement becomes critical when you understand what has historically destroyed many steam locomotives, because the most common cause of boiler explosions has long been the crown sheet losing water coverage and overheating under direct fire. The crown sheet is the top plate of your firebox, the steel barrier between the 1800-degree coal fire underneath and the water above. As long as water stays in contact with the top side, the metal maintains structural integrity under steam pressure. But expose that plate to direct fire heat, and the steel starts glowing red and losing strength, while you have over 200 pounds per square inch pushing against it. The plate sags and deforms. If someone notices the water level dropped and adds cold water to bring it back up, that cold water hits the superheated metal and flashes instantly to steam. The pressure spike tears the entire boiler apart from the inside in a fraction of a second. Railroad people called it double boiling, and Phillips spent his last moments insisting that his experience did not appear to match that scenario because he believed he had maintained proper water level the entire run. After management told Davenport the locomotive was safe to operate, that boiler let go with enough violence to be heard for miles through the mountain gorge. The investigation panel that Clinchfield assembled afterward, loaded with senior railroad executives and some state officials, came back with their official finding after examining what was left. No definitive cause could be determined. The boiler had landed approximately 361 feet forward, while the frame, drivers, and tender remained on the rails behind it. Cylinder heads were blown off, superheater tubes were ejected forward in that characteristic splayed pattern, and the firebox crown sheet had completely disintegrated. Too much of the locomotive had been destroyed. The physical evidence was too fragmented, and investigators concluded they could not make a conclusive ruling about what triggered the failure. Fragments interpreted as crown sheet material showed heat damage consistent with low water exposure, but whether that damage came from gauge failure, crew error, or mechanical problems could not be determined from the destroyed evidence. Head brakeman Floyd Sparks was 28, relatively new to the railroad, riding up front that night, and the explosion created a debris field across the mountainside that made any kind of detailed mechanical investigation nearly impossible. 740 was hauling 70 loaded coal cars through the Nolichucky Gorge where Tennessee meets North Carolina, requiring pusher engine 731 behind to help shove all that weight up the mountain. It was a routine coal drag, the kind of run these crews had done hundreds of times, except this time, something inside that L3 class 2882 Mallet compound went catastrophically wrong. The locomotive had been built in 1923 at the Brooks Works in Dunkirk, New York. Builder's number 65046, one of 10 L3 locomotives the Clinchfield rostered, and by April 1948 it had accumulated 25 years of hard service through mountain territory, running at 240 pounds per square inch boiler pressure. So Phillips says the water level was fine, but faulty water gauges were a persistent problem throughout steam locomotive operations. The gauge is a glass tube connected to the boiler at the top and bottom by pipes, and scale from calcium and magnesium in the boiler water can block those passages and give false readings. Federal regulations required those gauge glass connections cleaned and inspected every 31 days, specifically because this clogging was so common. But on a locomotive that had been working hard for 25 years through mountain territory, components wear and systems degrade. If a gauge became partially blocked, it could show adequate water when the actual level had dropped below the crown sheet, leaving the crew unaware as the crown sheet overheated without warning. On Mallet compounds like 740 with enormous fireboxes, the water constantly moves around inside the boiler on grades. Going uphill, it surges backward. Coming downhill, it rushes forward. And you can temporarily expose sections of crown sheet without the gauge showing any change. Phillips could have been watching that gauge the entire night, seeing readings that told him everything was fine, while the actual condition inside the boiler was heading toward catastrophic failure. They had fusible plugs as backup safety, threaded bronze devices installed in the crown sheet that were supposed to melt at 450 degrees and vent steam into the firebox as a warning. But those could fail from corrosion or clogging, and on a locomotive pulling heavy tonnage through a narrow mountain gorge at night with limited safe places to stop, reaction time matters enormously. This wasn't some isolated incident that year. Contemporary railroad records show multiple aging mallets failed in 1948. Chesapeake in Ohio. T1 number 3020 exploded in May near Chillicothe, and Union Pacific number 9018 exploded in October at Upland, both events later attributed in official reports to crown sheet failures. The steam locomotive fleet was aging across the entire industry as railroads transitioned toward diesel power. Maintenance demands were intense, and these machines were being worked hard right up until retirement. The Clinchfield operated 136 different steam locomotives across 67 years, and number 740 was their only boiler explosion. The 7 other surviving L3 engines continued service until 1952, when the Clinchfield retired them, though none experienced similar failures. That tells you they normally maintain their equipment well, and it makes this failure even more pointed when you know that Ed Davenport had, according to later accounts, warned management the locomotive needed extra attention beyond the standard inspection schedule. 8 months after the explosion, the railroad brought in their first diesel locomotives, and by April 1954, the last steam engine was gone from the roster. Ed Davenport is buried at Pine Grove Methodist Church in Ingalls. His niece remembered the service drew huge crowds of railroad people who had worked with him over the years. He had achieved his goal of becoming a locomotive engineer. He had recognized when his machine needed additional work. He had raised those concerns, and then he took it out on the run they said was safe. The boiler he had been concerned about tore itself apart at 1:15 in the morning in a remote mountain gorge and left questions that nobody could answer definitively. There were Phillips' final words, insisting they had plenty of water, and Davenport's warning that went unheeded. The investigation found it could not determine a cause because too much evidence had been destroyed. Either the gauge was completely wrong and showed full when the boiler was running dangerously low, or something else failed in a way that does not match the standard pattern. Maybe there was a mechanical problem somewhere else in the boiler. Maybe the crown sheet had been weakened by years of thermal cycling and finally gave out even with adequate water coverage. The investigation might have found answers if there had been enough evidence left to examine, but the explosion destroyed so much of the locomotive that definitive conclusions became impossible to reach. All of it adds up to the only boiler explosion in Clinchfield history, and a disaster that still does not have complete answers 75 years later.